There is a number that Jamaica never discusses publicly. Not in Parliament, not in the headlines, not in the tourism brochures that ask the world to come and enjoy the warmth of the island. This number is not a secret in the way that secrets are locked in vaults. It is hidden in plain sight, buried inside contracts signed decades ago, inside royalty rates set before most Jamaicans alive today were born, inside agreements that have never been renegotiated in a serious, structural way. The number is what Jamaica should be receiving from its own earth, and the distance between what it should receive and what it actually keeps. That distance is the story of an entire economy and the quiet tragedy of a nation that has been rich underground while struggling on the surface. Jamaica sits on one of the largest deposits of bauxite in the world. Bauxite is the raw material from which alumina is refined, and from alumina, aluminum is made. Aluminum is in everything. It is in the aircraft that carries tourists to Kingston. It is in the cans that hold the beverages sold in every corner of the world. It is in the infrastructure of modern civilization. And the ore that makes all of it possible has been coming out of Jamaican soil for over 70 years. 70 years. This is not a young industry. It is not an experiment. It is a mature, deeply established system of extraction. And yet the standard of living of the average Jamaican, when held up against the total value of what has left the island underground, should trouble anyone who looks honestly at the math. This is not about blame cast carelessly. This is about a structure, a system that was designed with a certain outcome in mind, and that has continued producing that outcome with remarkable consistency. To understand the number hidden inside Jamaica's resource economy, you have to understand how bauxite became the center of a negotiation that Jamaica entered from a position of weakness and has never fully reversed. When bauxite mining began in Jamaica in the early 1950s, the island was still a British colony. The companies that arrived, large North American aluminum corporations, negotiated access to Jamaican land and ore at terms set by colonial administrators who had no democratic mandate to speak for the Jamaican people. The deals were struck. The infrastructure was built. The ore began to flow. And then in 1962, Jamaica became independent. But the contracts did not become independent with it. The rights to extract remained largely in the hands of foreign companies. The Jamaican government inherited a nation that already had extraction underway, already had its terms set, and already had a structural dependency embedded before a single Jamaican citizen had voted on any of it. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the standard economic analysis. Independence arrived. The flag was raised. The anthem was sung. But the ledger stayed the same. And changing a ledger that was already producing profits for others, that requires a different kind of courage than political independence. It requires economic sovereignty. And those two things, as history has shown again and again across the black world, do not arrive at the same time. The 1970s were a turning point. Under Prime Minister Michael Manley, Jamaica made a serious attempt to renegotiate the terms of its bauxite relationship. A production levy was introduced. Jamaica sought to join with other bauxite-producing nations to form something like a cartel, a bloc that could push back on the pricing power of the large aluminum multinationals. It was an act of genuine economic courage, and the response was swift. The companies reduced production. They shifted operations to other countries. They made very clear that the system had alternatives and that Jamaica's leverage was limited. The lesson the global economy delivered in that moment was brutal. Even when you try to take back the number, those who built the system around keeping it will use every tool available to resist. By the early 1980s, A new government was in place. The political pendulum had swung. Jamaica went to the International Monetary Fund for financial support, and with that support came conditions. Structural adjustment, liberalization, the logic of opening markets, reducing state ownership, and attracting foreign investment by making the regulatory environment more competitive, which in practice often meant less demanding on the companies doing the extracting. The leverage that Manley's government had tried to build was quietly walked back. The number went back into the shadows, and the ore kept moving. This is not a story unique to Jamaica. This is a pattern. It is a pattern that anyone studying economic sovereignty across the Black world will recognize immediately. A nation discovers it has something of enormous value. Foreign capital arrives to help develop it. The terms of that development are set in an era of weakness, legal imbalance, or outright colonial control. The nation eventually gains political independence, but not economic independence. When it tries to assert more control, financial pressure is applied. The nation's own debt becomes the mechanism of discipline, and the extraction continues, refined, restructured, but fundamentally unchanged in who benefits most. When you look at the royalty rates that have historically governed bauxite extraction in Jamaica, the numbers are striking. For much of the industry's history, Jamaica received royalties that, measured against the global market value of the finished aluminum that ultimately resulted from that ore, amounted to a small fraction of the true value chain. The ore leaves the island. It is processed elsewhere. It becomes alumina. The alumina is refined into aluminum. The aluminum is sold into global markets at prices that reflect the full value of the finished product. But Jamaica, in the most stripped-down version of this arrangement, was paid for the early step, not the final value. This is the architecture of extraction. You export the raw, you import the processed. You receive a fraction. The difference is captured somewhere else. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it is not abstract. If you take bauxite from Jamaican ground and the finished aluminum that results from it trades at a price that is many times higher than the royalty paid at the extraction stage, then the people of Jamaica have effectively subsidized the global aluminum industry for 70 years. They have provided the foundational resource, and they have received a portion of the return that reflects not their share of the value, but their position in the hierarchy of global production. That hierarchy was not designed by Jamaicans. It was designed by people who needed raw materials and had the capital and political relationships to go get them on their own terms. Now here is where the analysis deepens, because this is not merely a historical grievance, it is a present-day structural reality. Jamaica's bauxite industry has contracted significantly over the decades. Mines have closed. Production has fallen. Some would argue this means the conversation is less urgent than it once was. But that argument misses the point entirely. The structural logic that governed bauxite does not disappear when bauxite becomes less prominent. It migrates. It replicates. You see it in how Jamaica's debt obligations constrain its fiscal space. You see it in how tourism revenue, which is now a primary driver of the economy, flows predominantly through internationally owned hotel chains, airlines, and booking platforms, with Jamaican workers employed throughout the system, but Jamaican capital holding a minority of the value. You see it in how public assets have been privatized over the years in ways that transferred ownership away from the state and toward private interests, often with international financing attached. The number is not just inside the bauxite story. The number is the pattern, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. This is where another part of the world becomes relevant to the Jamaican analysis. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country in West Africa with gold deposits that have attracted significant foreign mining interest over many years. What Ibrahim Traoré's government has argued, in policy terms that extend beyond any single political figure, is that the relationship between extractive value and national benefit must be fundamentally recalibrated. The core question Burkina Faso has put on the table is not whether foreign companies can participate in mining. The question is whether participation by foreign companies is the same thing as ownership by the nation, and whether the revenue structure of the industry should reflect the nation's needs rather than primarily the capital's returns. This is the language of economic sovereignty applied to a specific resource context. The reason this matters for Jamaica is not because Jamaica should follow any other nation's path exactly. It matters because it demonstrates that the question of who controls the terms of extraction is a live question. It is not settled. It is not inevitable that a nation rich in resources must receive only a fraction of the value those resources generate. When Ibrahim Traoré speaks about sovereignty over natural resources, he is articulating something that Michael Manley was articulating in 1974. That the nation's earth belongs to the nation, and that any arrangement that says otherwise should be treated as a problem to be solved, not a permanent condition to be managed. For Jamaica, the most pressing version of this question today may not be bauxite at all. It may be debt. Because the debt that Jamaica carries, the obligations to international creditors, the conditionalities attached to IMF arrangements over many decades, functions in a similar structural way to an unfavorable mining contract. It constrains what the government can spend. It shapes what policies are politically viable. It creates a fiscal ceiling beneath which all domestic ambitions must fit. And the terms of that debt, the interest rates, the repayment schedules, the structural benchmarks that must be met, those were also negotiated from positions of unequal power. Jamaica has made genuine progress in recent years on debt reduction. The numbers have improved. The fiscal position is stronger than it was in the darkest years of structural adjustment. And there are Jamaican economists and policymakers who have worked seriously and with real skill to navigate this terrain. None of this should be diminished. But improvement within a system is not the same as changing the system. And the question that economic sovereignty asks is always the deeper one. Not whether the numbers are better, but whether the structure itself reflects the interests of the people who live inside it. What would it actually look like for Jamaica to reclaim the hidden number? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a policy question. It begins with transparency. Every contract governing resource extraction, every royalty agreement, every production sharing arrangement, these should be publicly available for analysis by Jamaican citizens and independent economists. Transparency is not a radical demand. It is the minimum condition for any meaningful accountability. The second step is valuation. Jamaica needs an independent, rigorous assessment of what its remaining natural assets, not just bauxite, but all subsurface resources, all public land, all state-controlled assets, are actually worth at current market conditions and forward projections. Not what was negotiated in 1950. Not what was deemed acceptable in 1982. What they are worth now, in a world where commodity prices and global demand have been reshaped by climate transition, technology, and geopolitical realignment. The third step is renegotiation. Contracts that were signed under conditions of economic duress, or under colonial governance, or under IMF conditionality that restricted the nation's bargaining position, should be subject to audit and renegotiation. This is not expropriation. This is what sovereign nations do when they are functioning as sovereign nations. It requires political will. It requires insulation from the financial pressure that will inevitably come in response. And it requires a population that understands what is being fought for, which is exactly why this analysis matters. The fourth step, and the most profound, is reinvestment architecture. If Jamaica were to genuinely recapture more of the value from its resource economy, whether through higher royalties, greater state participation in production, or renegotiated contracts, the central question becomes where that value goes. Resource wealth that flows into state budgets without institutional structure around its deployment has a history of disappearing into consumption spending, debt service, or corruption. What economic sovereignty actually requires is not just getting more money. It is building institutions that are capable of converting that money into lasting national wealth. Sovereign wealth funds, public development banks, long-term infrastructure investment, education and skills systems that capture the nation's human capital. These are the mechanisms that turn a resource advantage into a generational asset. In this sense, the conversation about Jamaica's resource economy is not really about bauxite alone. It never was. It is about whether Jamaica builds the institutional architecture to be a truly sovereign economy, one that captures value, allocates it strategically, and compounds it over time for the benefit of its own people. And that architecture has to be built deliberately, because no one who is currently benefiting from the absence of it will help build it voluntarily. There is a line of argument that says Jamaica is a small island economy, and the leverage available to it is inherently limited. That global capital is mobile and will simply move elsewhere if terms become less favorable. That the path forward is integration into global markets on whatever terms are available, not confrontation over the terms themselves. This argument is not stupid. It reflects real constraints that policymakers face. But it is also an argument that has been used across the entire history of extraction in the Black world to justify every unfavorable arrangement that has ever been signed. The question of leverage is a real question. But the assumption that leverage is always too small to use is itself a form of ideological control. It is the belief system that keeps the number hidden. What Ibrahim Traoré and the broader movement for economic sovereignty across the African continent have forced back into the global conversation is the idea that small leverage, used at the right moment and with the right political strategy, can shift terms. Not immediately, not without cost, but shifts have happened before. The 1974 bauxite levy was a shift. It was partially reversed, but it happened. It demonstrated that a government with popular backing and a clear economic argument could move a number that powerful interests wanted to keep fixed. The cost was real, the pressure was real, but the possibility was also real. For the Jamaican diaspora, the millions of Jamaicans and people of Jamaican descent living in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and across the Caribbean, this analysis is not academic. It is personal. When families in Kingston struggle with cost of living pressures that seem disconnected from the visible wealth of the island's landscape and tourism economy, the hidden number is part of the explanation. When young Jamaicans migrate in search of economic opportunities that their home economy cannot provide, the structure of extraction is part of the context. The diaspora sends remittances back to Jamaica every year, a flow of money that, in recent decades, has been among the largest sources of foreign exchange the island receives. In other words, Jamaican labor exported abroad is partly filling the gap left by Jamaican resources exported without adequate return. The people subsidize the system twice. This is the moral weight of the hidden number. It is not simply a policy debate between economists. It is the lived reality of a population that has been resource-rich for generations and economically constrained throughout. The land has value. The ore has value. The labor has value. The culture has value. The question is, who captures that value and under what terms? The answer to that question is not written in stone. It is written in contracts, in legislation, in institutional arrangements, and in the political choices that Jamaican citizens and their representatives make. Contracts can be renegotiated. Legislation can be changed. Institutions can be built or rebuilt. Political choices can shift when people understand clearly what is at stake. That is why the analysis matters. That is why the number needs to come out of the shadows and into the public conversation, not as a source of rage, but as a source of clarity. Because clarity is the beginning of power. Economic sovereignty is not a destination that arrives all at once. It is a direction. It is the consistent, deliberate effort to orient a nation's economic arrangements toward the interests of its own people. To ask, at every decision point, whether this contract, this agreement, this institutional structure actually serves the Jamaican people or serves someone else. That question, asked persistently and seriously, is what changes the number over time. The ore is in the ground. The debt is on the books. The contracts are on file. The history is on the record. And somewhere inside all of that is a number. The real number, the full number, the one that reflects what Jamaica's earth is actually worth to the people who have built their lives above it. That number has been hidden long enough. The first act of sovereignty is simply to find it.